You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. Balitang thinking, hindi breaking. In this episode,
The fighting must stop immediately. I am deeply concerned about the terrible toll on civilians, the appalling humanitarian situation, and the horrifying prospects of further escalation.
today, the US announced the start of a 72-hour ceasefire in Sudan. Pero teka teka, what's going on there? And why should Filipinos care?
Hundreds of people have been killed and injured.
That's United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He was speaking days after a violent power struggle erupted in Sudan between rival factions of the military on April 15.
Fighting in urban areas is particularly dangerous for civilians, including children, who have repeatedly been forced to shelter in schools and evacuate from hospitals under fire. This is completely outrageous.
Before we dig our toes into the politics, nasaan ba ang Sudan? If you look at a map, Sudan is next to Egypt. And right across the Red Sea is Saudi Arabia. That's why they say it's a nation of two races, Arab and African. Now the fighting is scattered across the country, but it's more intense in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. The UN counts at least 427 dead and more than 3,700 injured as of April 24. Ngayon na lang nag-intensify ang fighting. Pero actually, noong 2019 pa nagsimula ang conflict. On April 11, 2019, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir was overthrown by the Sudanese army. Armed forces seized control from al-Bashir after 4 months of civilian protests demanding his ouster. Hundreds of thousands of Sudanese marched against rising food prices and long-standing corruption and repression. Dozens were killed. And the ending? Al-Bashir's 3-decade dictatorship, well, ended. Pero ganito kasi, the protests and the violence continued months after the military seized power and formed a transitional government. The civilian leaders and the military eventually agreed to share power for 3 years. Pero in 2021, the Sudanese army and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces or RSF seized back control in yet another coup. Now those two factions are warring with each other. Army General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the leader of RSF, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, are essentially battling for control of the country. Analysts believe their disagreement over how the powerful RSF would be integrated into the military brought about the clashes. They fought over key levers of power, including the presidential palace, the airport, and state TV. The army has conducted airstrikes on RSF bases, including the ones in residential areas. The RSF has fought back with anti-aircraft weapons. There's no sign that either side will back down.
We urgently need a humanitarian pause. Score of people who have been killed is high, and hundreds have been injured. As the fighting continues in densely populated area, we worry that the toll will climb. People must be able to have access to food, fuel, and other critical supplies and services for their family.
That's Abdou Dieng. He's the UN Acting Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Sudan.
Humanitarian operations are severely hampered. Fighting and attack on airport and other critical humanitarian access hub has made humanitarian operations virtually impossible. Warehouse, vehicle, and other humanitarian assets have been attacked, looted, or seized.
Abdou is still in Sudan, but was one of many humanitarian workers extracted from a danger zone.
access to health services is almost impossible because those workers cannot move out of their home to provide services to health services. Access to water is almost impossible. Access to energy also. You can see the dire situation in which we are living here in Sudan. There is no humanitarian services provided to Sudanese the last 5 days, simply because it's not possible for any humanitarian workers to move outside of their home location or their compound.
Like we said at the start of this podcast, the US announced the start of a 3-day ceasefire. But let's see if this ceasefire holds. Kasi, previous attempts at ceasefires have failed. Even the one RSF called for to celebrate Eid al-Fitr. But the UN has emphasized that this reprieve is critical.
If there is a pause, we will be able to conduct further assessment to see the nature of the damage. What we know is there are lots of supplies which have been looted, including 4,000 metric tons of food. And the only way to come to help people is to see a pause or an end to this conflict. Otherwise, in the next coming days, the situation will be much worse than what it was.
We'll check in on the Philippine evacuation efforts in Sudan after a quick break.
Right now, we are hoping that the 72-hour ceasefire that has been declared will hold. Makapag-take advantage tayo, mailabas natin ang mga tao natin.
That's President Marcos. Western countries, including the US, the UK, France, and Germany, airlifted their diplomats out of the country this week. The evacuation of foreign nationals and even some Sudanese have also begun.
Ang mahirap is that even the land routes are not completely safe. As yet, yung mga airport na binomba pa, hindi talaga magamit.
Up until last week, the government counted 300 Filipinos in Sudan. That number has more than doubled since then.
Alam ng ating embahada up to recently, ang nakaregister mga 256.
That's Foreign Affairs Undersecretary for Migrant Workers, Eduardo de Vega.
Tapos parami ng parami kasi pag nananawagan ng embassy na mag-email kayo dahil gusto namin malaman kung saan kayo. Umabot ng 300, 500. Ngayon, kakausap ko lang kay Ambassador Esdin Tago, 696 na ang nakaregister sa kanila. Out of that, 156 handa nang umalis at any given moment. May passport sila, may papeles, naghihintay lang ng tao pakanawagan ng embassy. No? Ngayon,
50 Filipinos have already been repatriated as of this recording. The DFA said another 300 are waiting to be rescued.
Kasi yung mga kababayan natin nakalikas, masaya sila, no? Pero yung mga naiiwan na kababayan sa Sudan, hindi ako magbobola sa inyo. Siyempre, gera to, kaya hindi sila masaya. At nakakaawa nga yung iba pag makita ko yung mga messages na buti naman, may internet pa, no? At may kuryente, at minsan nawawala. Pero pinapadala kami ng messages, pati yung embassy, yung isa sabi, parang iniwan siya ng amo niya doon na yung amo niya basta umalis para siyang pusa daw or aso na iniwan lang doon. Pero ang maganda naman, walang casualty at walang injuries.
Here's Migrant Workers Secretary Toots Ople at a press briefing earlier today.
I just came from a meeting with the President and we discussed the situation of our OFWs in Sudan. I informed him that I will be leaving tonight to oversee the welfare operations of the department in making sure that those who are able to cross the border would be given financial assistance upon crossing kasi marami sa kanila wala talagang dala at all.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Carl Sayat. If you like this episode, share it with a friend or two, and don't forget to give it a 5-star rating on your podcast app. At para sa mga mahilig manood sa YouTube, PumaPodcast na rin po kami doon. Just search Puma Podcast and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.